everybody, Deathblade here with another Chinese fantasy novel FAQ. Today I'm going to be talking about face and how it is portrayed in Chinese fantasy novels and by extension television shows, movies, and comic books and things like that. Is it portrayed realistically, unrealistically? How realistic or unrealistic? We're going to get into all of that stuff. I'm not going to delve too deeply into the definition of face and what it means in Chinese culture. There are plenty of resources that you can find if you do some searching online for that. Basically, let's use this definition for face. It is the dignity or prestige or reputation that a person has publicly and in social circles. That's basically all that it is. The word itself, or I should say the definition or the idea of face as being that sort of like reputation or dignity, actually came into the English language from Chinese. And actually the word is similar in a lot of languages, and apparently the origin is from China. And that kind of gives you an idea of how important it is to Chinese culture. We're going to get to it in a minute, but first I want to explain really quickly why I feel that I qualify to give an informed opinion on this. I have read a lot of Chinese fantasy novels, which is what we're talking about here. I started reading those novels before I started learning Chinese and before I came to China, and continue to do so after. And obviously I've translated a lot of Chinese fantasy novel fiction from Chinese into English. And in addition to all of that, I've been studying language for quite a few years. Oh man, how many years has it been now? It's been more than 10 years at this point. Kind of forgot. I lived in Chinatown in Manhattan for a couple years, and I've been here in China for more than 7 years. So I have a lot of experience on the China side, and I also have a kind of a unique perspective as somebody who's both a fan of and intimately involved in taking these concepts and bringing them from Chinese into English. So that's how I qualify. One of the reasons why I wanted to get into this topic is because I often see on discussion forums and in chapter discussions online, I see people talking about how they feel it's unrealistic the way that characters are portrayed in the way that they react to losing face or gaining face, or even maybe why they feel they've lost face or gained face. I don't always necessarily see people express it in that way and literally say it's unrealistic. But I often see people laughing and joking about it as though it's just completely absurd the way the characters are reacting. And truth be told, that was how I felt about the whole face thing when I first started reading the Chinese fantasy novels many, many years ago. The novels that I read were not web novels. They were the more traditional Wuxia novels by Jin Yong, who is also known as Louis Cha, and Gulong and others. And I really remember back in the day when I was reading those stories, and I would see how people would get offended at seemingly the most inconsequential things, not being recognized or whatever. And then their reaction just seems so crazy. In fact, one specific instance jumps out to me. I just thought of this. It's been years since I read this scene, but there's a scene in the book, The Smiling Proud Wanderer. And I remember the main character meets some Shaolin monks, and in the martial arts world, Shaolin is supposed to be a righteous sect. But in his encounter with these monks, I remember you find out that the righteous sects in that novel especially aren't so righteous, and the unorthodox sects aren't so bad after all. And I just remember this scene where these Shaolin monks are just like doing crazy stuff, which seems so crazy all because of face or reputation, the name of their school or their own name. And that kind of stuff came up a lot, and I really felt it was unrealistic. And I see nowadays there's so many people reading Chinese fantasy novels, and obviously there are people who feel the way that I used to feel back then. So I want to talk about that a little bit. Now, face, as you can imagine, considering that the word face came into Western culture from Chinese culture, or I shouldn't say the word, not just the word, but that concept and that word together, since it came from Chinese culture, you can tell, obviously, it's pretty important in China. And if you do some searching on the internet in China about it, you will find that Chinese people know, and they're very well aware that their culture is one that pays a lot of importance to face. And that goes from the country itself on the world scene, political leaders and all that stuff, all the way down to smaller things like babies, even beyond that, pets, and the smallest things that you can imagine, face plays an important role. And essentially, the way that face is portrayed in these novels, here comes the answer to the whole question, and then I'll provide some more commentary. Basically, the way that face is portrayed in the novels, in terms of how people get offended, and things that they get offended about, or in the reverse, the way that they feel that they've gained face in certain situations. Actually, those are pretty realistic. The way that people flip out, that's actually kind of what happens in real life in China. I've seen it a million times. I'll give some examples later. What's unrealistic, kind of goes without saying, is what happens after that in the novels. Somebody gets mad because you blinked your eye, and then they kill your whole family and your whole city and your whole continent, and the planet explodes or whatever. That obviously doesn't happen in real life. Without getting into too much details about that, I'll give you my opinion, which is I think that part of that obviously is because these novels it take place in fictional worlds, which are fictional and are different from the world we live in. In the world we live in, it is not okay to kill people because you get mad at them. But in these novels, you get mad at somebody and you start fighting them. They start fighting you. You're roughly the same, skill and ability. That's not necessarily a bad thing, depending, obviously on the circumstances. These are worlds where the morality system is different. So obviously the way that people carry out the way that people vent their frustration is going to be different. But you can learn a lot about Chinese culture by paying attention to how the people take offense in these novels, because it's actually pretty realistic. I'm going to go into a couple experiences really quickly. Now, I know that my random personal experiences can't be used to explain all of Chinese culture and all of Chinese web novels and things like that, obviously. But these are some things that sort of changed my perspective about face in Chinese culture. And the biggest one is not one specific thing that happened, but actually a series of similar situations. When one thing happens, that could be an anecdote or a story, an outlier, you never know. But when something happens over and over again and it becomes a trend, that you can learn from that. And that's what happened to me. Before I got into translating full time, I was teaching. And the school that I taught at, it was an English school. The method of teaching was not just straight language learning. It was actually using the teaching of different school subjects such as math, science, language arts, social studies, and stuff, to using those methods to help students to learn English. And the students ranged anywhere from the youngest being 3 all the way up until 10 or 12 or so. Now, and the tuition for one course was very expensive. And the tuition would be probably about 2 months' salary for the average Chinese person. The people that worked at the school, most of them, it would be like 6 months worth of salary for those people if they wanted to send their kids there. It was pretty expensive. And the whole reason why most parents would send their kids there is probably for 2 reasons. Number one is English is pretty popular in China, and it's actually part of the standardized testing that kids go through in their school and in their education. So it's important. Number two is a lot of those parents want their kids eventually to go overseas to study, to America, UK, New Zealand, Australia, those places. The prevailing thought in China among most people is that those overseas colleges, especially in high schools as well, are better than the Chinese counterparts. So a lot of these parents, this is a pretty important thing we're talking about. They're spending a lot of money to send their kids to this school to learn English, ostensibly for their future. Now, the way that the classes work is there'll be a small group of kids, 10, 12, maybe 15 kids, that all kind of go to this one class and go through the course together. Then after that one unit, or when that one level is done, they'll proceed on to the next level, usually as one group, because the time slot is the same, the teacher's the same. All the kids tend to kind of go up through the levels in that way. But as you can imagine, as would be the case in a lot of schools like this, regardless of the subject, there's going to be some kids who excel and some who don't. Now, for whatever reason that is, it could be, some kids have a talent for language, some don't. In some cases, parents play a big role and force the kids to practice and study at home, and other parents don't. And that can affect the kids' progress. There's a million reasons why the kids might progress or not. But the point is, there are almost always these kids who don't progress. It gets to the end of the course and they are not ready to move on to the next level. As the head teacher of this school, I was basically in charge of the teaching department, and it was often my responsibility to go, since I speak Chinese, to go communicate with the parents, usually one-on-one, to try to resolve issues. And one of the big issues was always that issue, which is the kid did not progress well and is not ready to move on to the next level. So usually there would be two solutions, well, a few solutions to that problem. One of them would be to have the student redo that level, and another one would be to have the student actually go back to a previous level, because sometimes, for whatever reason, they might not have progressed very much at all, and it would be better to go get a more solid foundation before proceeding on to a higher level. And so that was what I was often tasked with doing, was trying to convince the parents to have their kid, take the class over again. Now, of course, there are many factors which play into that decision. For example, the time slot of the class, or the specific teacher that's teaching the class, a lot of different things. But another thing that played a huge role in it was face. And what I can tell you is, over many years of seeing this situation come up over and over again, I don't have any actual statistics, sorry, this is just my perception being in that role. The vast majority of parents refused to let their kids go to a different class, take the level over, or go backwards a level. I mean, going backwards a level, I can understand. Even in Western culture, that would be kind of embarrassing. But even just taking the course over again, the parents would literally say to me, how could I have any face if my kid doesn't progress with the other students? Or they would say, how could my kid have any face? Now, I understand that, taking a level over or going back is definitely an embarrassing thing, regardless of whatever culture you're in. But again, these parents are paying a huge amount of money, and they're doing this because they care about their kids' education and want their they want their child to learn English. And yet their face, or their child's face, was almost always more important. It didn't matter to them if the kid was not learning English. As you can imagine, if you don't complete a level of anything satisfactorily and then try to move on to a higher level, you're not going to have much progress. And it happened over and over again, and the parents didn't care. I taught, I don't know how many hundreds of students that I taught over the years, and I saw it over and over again. Kids in my own classes where I tried to convince the parents, why don't you come to even one of my classes? You wouldn't be very embarrassing. You could just switch to another one of my classes, a different time slot. Almost nobody would know, and it would be way better for the student. Throughout the, 5 or more years that I taught at this one particular school, I can only remember maybe 1 or 2 situations throughout all those years where a parent agreed to do that. When they did agree to do it, the student's progress was amazing. But this was something that really opened my eyes, because the parents would use those words, how could I have any face in front of the other parents if my student doesn't progress to the next level with all the other students? So that was one experience that I went through over and over again, sort of changed my view about how important face was. Now there's another story. I mentioned this on Twitter recently, and it's kind of funny, but it happened only a couple months ago. Actually, we went on vacation. The Deathblade clan went on vacation, and we were outside of a restaurant looking at the menu, where the hostess is greeting you, and we were looking at the menu. And Madame Deathblade, my wife, she's very Chinese, traditionally speaking. I mean, she's not super traditional, but typical, thinks like Chinese people think, and understands it, and acts like you would expect a Chinese person to act according to Chinese culture. And so anyway, we're there we are looking at the menu, and it was taking a really long time. She was literally going through every single menu item and asking me about it. Hey, do you think we should have this kind of fish? And I was like, okay, sure. And then she was like, well, maybe we should have steak. And I was like, fine, that's cool. I want steak. Let's get steak. And then she said, well, this looks also good too. And I was like, fine, let's have that. And then she was like, well, how about we have this kind of seafood? Now, I'm not a big seafood fan. So I was like, you know what? I really don't care. I'm not a big fan of seafood. Just get whatever kind of seafood you want. And it went on like this for a couple minutes. And I was getting more and more irritated until I was just like, you know what, I don't care. Just pick whatever you want. Let's go into the restaurant and sit down. And, she was like, dong. And I was like, oh. And, we walked in and sat down. And after the hostess walked away, she looked over at me. She was like, if you ever talk like that to me again in front of these people, I'm going to be very, very mad. Now, in Chinese web novels, maybe you've heard of like killing intent or a murderous aura. I mean, that's real. I've seen it in China a lot of times, and she's very good at it. Shh, I don't want her to hear this. Hopefully she doesn't watch this recording later. She usually looks at the recordings, but doesn't watch all the way through, so I should be safe. But man, she was just like really like, and it was because of that face. Now, I had said to her, I was like, what are you talking about? This, we were in China. I was like, they don't understand what I'm talking about. I'm speaking English. And because we were at like a resort at the time, a restaurant at a resort. And she was like, everybody here speaks English. Of course they can understand. And I was like, dun, dun. Okay, I got it. That was one that happened fairly recently. You would think that despite being in China for all these years, I would have learned my lesson about those kind of things. I had one more example, going back to the school, a situation which even more directly was a huge loss of face, and the reaction was exactly what you would see in a web novel. Long story short was another of the teachers at our school, a foreigner, Californian, just like myself, there was a student in his class who was like the problem student. I mean, like really just horribly behaved, violent. I mean, literally hitting other kids, breaking things. And that teacher had just had enough, and he ejected him out into the lobby where all the parents are sitting around waiting for the kids to come out of class. So all of a sudden, these parents are sitting there, and their kid gets kicked out of class in front of all the other parents. I mean, a moment ago I mentioned killing intent and murderous aura. You would not believe. These parents, I mean, if this had been a Chinese fantasy novel, like the school would have exploded. They were so completely mad. They were so mad that they could barely even talk. And I was in charge of handling this situation. We had to reschedule the meeting for the following day because they were just so upset. And, they refused to go back to that teacher's class, and they demanded all this stuff from the school, and the school gave it to them, discounts and everything, because their kid had been ejected out of the class without any warning. And of course, the kid was being really horrible. There's cameras in the class. Everybody can see it. So it wasn't like a really big shock to anybody. But man, the loss of face of those parents was just, so incredible. Okay, so those are my personal examples. I hope that this has helped you to understand a little bit more about face in China and in the Chinese fantasy novels. I seriously meant what I said a few minutes ago, which was you can learn a lot about Chinese culture by paying attention to how face is handled in the novels. Again, not the wipe out your sect or blow up your planet or whatever it is. Not that kind of stuff, but the way that people get offended at things and why, and all of those situations tend to be very realistic in terms of Chinese culture. Okay, I think I've gone on way longer than I usually do in these recordings. I hope this was helpful. Please hit me up with any other suggestions you have for videos, and I hope to see you next time.